Welcome to Lead Wisely by WonderTour. We're going to do something a little bit different with this series. After 110 episodes of talking about leadership lessons drawn from the stories we tell each other in popular media, we've been extracting lessons from heroes and the mentors and the people that we root for in our movies. We're going to spend this next series of episodes talking about the villains. We're going to talk about the people who make terrible decisions, the people whose leadership roles hurt other people, the people who, despite their best efforts, are thwarted because they fail to understand some fundamental truths about how the world works, or maybe just because they were opposed by an unreasonably talented hero. We'll find out. But I think it'll be fun to examine leadership lessons that we can draw from how not to turn into the villain. Being WonderTour, we are huge Star Wars fans, so we couldn't do anything other than start this series by talking about Darth Vader, the classic villain from the many, many Star Wars properties. So we're going to have an episode about Vader today, and as well as our next episode. We'll start by talking a little bit about his backstory, about Anakin Skywalker, and kind of how he turned into the terrible villain, and what his path looked like there. So we're going to start right out with a tough question about leadership, as always. Why do some leaders keep doubling down on their own mistakes? So, Drew, take us out. What do we got here?
Yeah, we love to look at examples like that. I mean, heck, you probably don't have to look too far. I don't have to look too far to see examples where I've doubled down on my own mistakes. And I think at the surface level, there's some bias that results in us doing it. It's the perspective that we see the situation from is only our own. And when we look at things from our own perspective, it's too easy to kind of, like Anakin does, start to navel gaze. You just look down at yourself and you start to see less of the world around you, see less of the relationships, not able to fully understand the impact that what you're doing has on somebody else the more you turn inwards on yourself. So I think some of it is just that bias, or even just outcome based bias, where you're just thinking about, well, yeah, it didn't seem good and it was kind of painful, but in the end, I got the job I wanted, or in the end, we landed the deal. So really, like, what could have gone better anyway? So I think there's a little bit of that. I just want to start by putting that over here and saying there is some of that. Now, to talk a little bit more about the story of Anakin and Darth Vader, I want to do a little bit of like a why analysis, kind of dig deeper here into why does Anakin, because he, again, is kind of emblematic of a movie villain. And unfortunately, as we talk about here on WonderTour, we all could become that type of a villain, not necessarily maybe wielding a lightsaber and force choking our inferiors.
But we'll get to that phase, yes. So.
Yeah, we could fall into that. So I think we just have to consider we don't want to become like that. We don't ever want to go down the path that Anakin goes down. And we'll talk about his path, but why a lot of it comes from trying to protect ourselves. I think we want to kind of double down on our mistakes because we feel like if we don't, we're going to get hurt. And it might be that our public image is going to get hurt, that somebody's going to be let down by us. I mean, that's a simple one. It's we don't want to let down the people closest to us. When in reality, if we keep doubling down and just shoveling our mistakes into the back closet until it's spilling out all over into the yard where everybody can see it, I mean, that's the issue. We do not want to ego protect in that way, where you're just trying to keep yourself from ever experiencing that loss of, or that humility that is needed in order to grow. So if we just kind of keep going from there, well, why? I think in the end for humans, it's about avoiding immediate pain. That's one of the main reasons that we keep doubling down. We just keep pushing the pain out and saying, I'll deal with that trauma later. Or I know that experience was painful, but I have so much on my plate right now that I can't possibly spend the time to process that and deal with it.
Let's talk about Anakin's journey a little bit here, because I think it's fun to examine. Like, the prequel movies get a lot of grief for being pretty clunky, right? For, there's epic, beautiful themes and all the cool stuff that's on the screen is beautiful, but the acting's got some rough edges and the writing's got some rough edges. But we start looking at sort of Anakin's journey here, where he's like a beloved up and coming member of this organization, and he gradually gets more and more dissatisfied with his personal alignment with the Jedi Order. And so he has terrible anger issues, right? Childhood trauma, whatever, right? But he's terrible anger issues, and so he keeps lashing out and making terrible decisions. And then when he makes a terrible decision and hurts somebody, literally or emotionally, then he is unable to admit that he might have screwed up. Like you said, he's protecting his own ego. He doesn't want to go back and say, "Oh, I was wrong." Right. And so he's like, "Oh no, well, that's because somebody else was terrible." And so he keeps doubling down on these mistakes. And so you've got this element of ego, like, why doesn't everybody think I'm amazing? You've got I can't admit that the thing that I did was probably bad and I should reflect on myself. Like, he's unable to take you say avoiding pain, the pain of like looking at himself and saying, "Oh, that was terrible." Like, he won't do that. We all recognize that. We've all done that, right? And there's also, I think, an element of fear here too, right? Like, he has got this recurring vision that's only in his head that some terrible thing's going to happen in the future, and only he can solve the problem, right? Where have we heard that before, right? Only he can solve the problem, and so he can justify over and over again doing increasingly terrible things to avoid this in the real world right now, to avoid this nebulous bad thing in the future that is only in his head. And that's uncomfortably familiar to some of us, right? Is that you can be so consumed by fear or by worry that you can do things that are not at all skillful in the present moment, and then like, oh well, that I can't lose face by admitting that I screwed up or that I was being fearful, so now I have to double down on that. You keep closing doors.
Yeah, it says digging a deeper and deeper hole. That's the risk that we all don't want to fall into here, Brian. So you started to lay up what we're going to talk about in the next section with the mountaintop in terms of fear and the dark side. But first, let's hit the intro.
Hi, I'm Brian Nutwell.
And I'm Drew Paroz.
And we are on a journey to become better leaders by touring fantastic worlds and inspiring lore by going on this WonderTour.
We connect leadership concepts to story context because it sticks to our brains better. You can find out more at WonderTourPodcast.com or on YouTube if you're listening on audio.
We're very excited about the pivot to video. This is great. So let's transition this. So we've got Anakin's journey. We can see that he starts with a lot of promise and has all of the mentorship and support that you could imagine. He gets some bad advice along the way. He maybe picks the wrong people to trust, right? But he keeps doubling down on his mistakes. He has these weaknesses of quickness to anger and egocentricity and fear and overconfidence in his own abilities, and those things seem to spiral him into a pretty dark place. So.
Yeah, and you can see the parallel there, Brian. I mean, the simple one is just when he goes back to Tatooine and he finds his mother, right, Shmi, in the camp with the sand people, and they end up, he is not able to save her, and she's brutally murdered and suffering. And what does he do? He turns around and he leans into his emotions, which we know is very anti-Jedi. And he just kills all the sand people, and then you kind of have that paralleled to the moment, which is perhaps the darkest moment in all of Star Wars, right? When he goes to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, and there's the like weird, grainy hologram video of him, cutting down these younglings, and those moments, it seems justifiable, right? When it's the sand people who impacted your family member with that suffering, and that loss eventually consumes you, and the grief, if not processed properly, leads him to become the type of person who can have that same type of moment with completely innocent people, because he has let the anger and the contempt build up in him over time. He's channeling his emotions as a way to what he thinks accomplish a mission or objective, but in the end he can't see anything outside of himself anymore. All he can see is his own self and his own flaws, and it just consumes him.
Yeah, and he's not happy about it. Like, he knows that he did a bad thing on Tatooine. He has angst about that, but then he doesn't change the way he makes decisions, right? He doesn't get any ability to harness himself. He just keeps doing it more, right? And again, this is maybe a thing that's familiar to some of us from our own lives, right? Like this, like, oh, wow, look, I made that terrible decision again. Oh, look at that. I got angry again in a meeting and I said a thing that I shouldn't have said and I laughed out at somebody that I shouldn't have laughed out at. Like, that's a thing that we do.
Yeah, mine is oftentimes saying something to my wife in a tone that, as I'm saying it to me in my own head, seems like it's going to sound okay, because in the end my intention was not to be mean, and my intention was not to be condescending, but apparently I am not capable of saying it in a way that was that way, which tells me that I need to reevaluate, because if it comes out that way into the world, then there's something in my head, there's something in my mind that is leading it to come out that way.
Yeah. There are those moments when we're ignorant of our impact we have on others. There's moments when we're so angry that we just don't, we don't care, like we're enjoying being angry. But there's also the fear moments where you maybe should be addressing a problem and you're not, because you just don't want to, or you don't want to deal with it, and so you just let something go and go and go, and then it gets out of control, and that's probably my failure mode. So, but I think the thesis of this whole series is that we all have this capacity to be villainous. Like you said, we all have this in us, just as we've been preaching for the last 110 episodes. We all have the capacity to be tremendous, magnanimous, caring, nurturing leaders, right? And it's just different choices. It's just different habits. It's just different patterns over and over again. This is it's an illustrative, as you said earlier, an anti-pattern, right? It's an illustrative pattern of like Anakin makes all the wrong choices and keeps doubling down over them, and so it leads him to a really dark place. So set us up. Where's this lead him? What's our mountaintop moment for this episode?
All right. So the mountaintop moment, to me, is the pinnacle of the prequel trilogy. Now, I know there's a lot of different opinions on this, but we talked about kind of the doubling down that he has on these, the battle with Mace Windu, all of these different moments, basically, the turning to the dark side. And I think it all culminates in the he can never go back moment, which is the lightsaber duel on Mustafar between Anakin and Obi-Wan. Everything in this movie kind of builds up to the point where now you have the mentor who has continually, in Obi-Wan, bent over backwards to try to bring Anakin back. He knows that at first Obi-Wan is blind to it. We do see that, but eventually he does know exactly what's happening, and he is trying to bring him back. He's giving him forgiveness. He's going to continue to try to teach him. And it's builds up to this moment where the two of them duel on Mustafar, and we get the classic, "You were supposed to be the chosen one."
My brother Anakin. Yes, there's a lot of emoting going on in that scene, but and along with lava spewing everywhere and lightsaber duels on floating pods, and yeah, it's over the top, as only Star Wars can do, for sure.
It is, right? And you get the build up to the moment where it's over, Anakin, I have the higher ground. And yet he still can't give up, right? He still can't concede. He just keeps doubling down. No, I'm right. No, I need to be vindicated for all of these things, even to the point where he has his mentor who's willing to sacrifice himself to help Anakin. And Anakin can't see it anymore because he's so blind now by the dark side. He's so blinded by the anger and contempt he's been building up.
Yeah, and he's all about himself, right? And so this is the natural end of this arc, is that even the person who is the most committed to him, even the person that is the most willing to forgive him, the most willing to face all of his crap and try to step in anyway, it ends up in open conflict with him, right? And that's exaggerated to the point where it's a lightsaber duel in the lava fields, but it's also like, that's a thing, right? Like, if you're committed to fighting all the time, if the whole world is black and white and you have to be right, and therefore anybody that disagrees with you is wrong, you're gonna end up fighting with everybody. And I think we've all seen people like that, right? We've seen, we've had those patterns.
And we've probably seen relationships that either could have gone that way, or we know people who have let relationships go that way. Now, I'm not saying stay in a harmful relationship if it's traumatic for you and continues to be unapologetically harmful to your life, there's definitely times where we need to cut ourselves out of relationships, certainly. But I think we've all probably met people at, or been people that have had 20-year rifts with a parent over a situation that never got resolved or something
Hmm.
like that, that lost a friendship that they had for decades over, money or something like that, where they're just, nobody went back and resolved the situation. Neither party was willing to have the humility to just have a conversation about what needed to happen to go forward. And so you end up with this lightsaber duel on Mustafar type moment where, the two brothers are fighting, and in the end Anakin gets left for dead there. And Brian, what does that turn him into, that he never concedes in that situation? What happens next?
Yeah, that's he turns into like this, he's locked himself into, there's only one path available to him, right? He's closed off all of the doors that would have potentially let him reflect or improve or be a be a positive force in the life around him, in the world around him. And so the only thing that he's got left is to turn into Darth Vader, right? Is to turn into sort of this embodiment of this ego and anger, and using your skills to sort of inflict discomfort on everyone around you.
Oh, and isn't it interesting that Darth Vader and the way that the costume is designed, and we can argue this was not intentional, obviously, with what we know of how Lucas created Vader, but Lucas does masterfully, even in the prequels, kind of weave a story about characters that is transcendent. And Vader, right, his emotions, everything that's inside of Anakin comes out in Vader, and it becomes the only thing left. It's this black and
Right.
white version of Anakin now, where all he can be is the angry executioner that pursues single vision his purpose, and nothing can get in his way. There is no shades of gray. There is no balance anymore.
And he is literally wearing the shell, right? He's wearing the armor. Like, he doesn't expose his human face. He doesn't interact with other people as a human. He only interacts with people as the shell, as this avatar character that he's constructed, right? And I think that's we all do that to some extent, but when the only tools you have to construct your interactions with others, or to filter your interaction with others, are based on hatred and fear and exerting power when you can, that's a pretty limited life. That's a pretty limited kinds of impact that you can have on the world around you, right? You pretty much narrowed yourself down to one possible kind of career style and one possible set of interactions.
We talk about character as destiny. There's a quote that I'm going to absolutely butcher that says, like, we start with the ability to make choices, that you can choose life or death. Like you said, you always stand at the door. Are you going to choose life, or are you going to choose death? It's not always that clear, but in the end, as a human, your character is formed, and your character is your destiny. And by the time that you have been formed for decades and decades, those choices are not easy to make anymore. It's not, you don't have as many options. Once you've put on the Vader mask, your option is very clear. You execute the mission at the cost of whoever is in front of you, and you're now a slave to Palpatine. That's what it
Right.
has become.
Right. And I love what you just said, the character destiny framing. Like, we see the contrast between Obi-Wan, who was one of our classic magnanimous leaders in our previous episodes, and Anakin's behavior here is simply the ability to say, I screwed up. Like, I was wrong. I'm sorry that I didn't see what was happening. I'm willing to change my behavior. Let me help you, right? In these movies, Anakin's totally unable to do that. He keeps closing those doors. If character is destiny, if you want to nurture a character in a specific direction, you're never going to make all the decisions right. You're never, none of us are going to conduct our lives so that we never get angry and we never piss somebody off and we never lash out and flame somebody, or, ruin a relationship that would have been really good for us. Like, none of us will ever successfully navigate our whole lives without doing those things. We're all going to do the Darth Vader moments, right? We're all going to just be terrible beings at some point. But if you don't have the ability to look at that and go, wow, that was terrible and unskillful, and I shouldn't do that again, and I'm going to either apologize to the person that I hurt, or at least look critically at myself and say, I shouldn't do that the same way next time. I'm going to look at myself in the eye and go, all right, how do I not do this again? If you don't have that ability to course correct, then there's only one direction you go. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of what we see is that, Obi-Wan in this series is portrayed as being able to say, I'm sorry, I failed you, but I still want to help. Right? Like, I'm sorry we're in this terrible situation, but let me help, let's solve the problem together. And Anakin is sort of the avatar of not being able to do that, of being able to say, no, I'm going to solve all the problems, and my black and white view of the world is the only one, and I'm really enjoying being angry right now, and I'm going to go solve the problems with my power, right? That only develops your character in one direction if you don't have the ability to course correct.
Yeah, there's not any nuance there. And I think that leads us well into our practical application. So now how do we use this based on talking about this duel on Mustafar? We talked about kind of all these different pivotal events in Anakin's journey. And we all have pivotal events in our own stories. So how do we avoid at least this one trap? We'll talk about how to avoid different villainous traps, but how do we avoid this one trap of anger? And of course, this is going to be overly simplistic because it's a movie, it's Star Wars, and we're only going to be talking about this for a few minutes. But I want to leverage a model, and I think this model was from John Mark Comer. He may have taken it from somewhere else, but a very simple, 6.5, maybe 7 steps model of anger. Because I think we can watch how this plays out in Anakin's life.
Right.
So
okay. All right, let's do it.
Number 1, you get angry because your will is thwarted. We all have experienced that. I don't have to sell you on. We get angry because we wanted something one way and it happened another way, which results in our ego being wounded. Now, you yourself feel like there is something like a briar in you, basically. There is something that is not right. You're not complete. Right. So you end up playing the self-righteous villain. You end up playing the self-righteous victim in this situation if you cannot process that pain to your ego. And there's a great quote.
Somebody else has hurt me. The world has hurt me. Yes. Okay.
Yes. There's a great quote here from C.S. Lewis. The pleasure of anger, the gnawing attraction which makes one return again and again to its theme, lies. I believe in the fact that one feels entirely righteous when one is angry. Then the other person is pure black and you are pure white.
Yeah, and that's I don't know if fun's the right word, right? But it's very engaging to be angry, to be like, I'm going to solve this problem. This is a problem in the world, and I can't believe that this injustice to me exists, and so I'm going to go crush it, right? It's a little bit empowering. Like I get to go do the thing. I get to go solve the problem. I get to exercise my power. The self-righteousness is 100% one of the reactions to, well, I couldn't possibly be wrong, therefore.
Yeah, Anakin, of course, right? He defies the Jedi Order and having this relationship that he has with Padme, and then she ends up being pregnant. And of course, now he's doubling down on things until he is the self-righteous victim. Well, the Order's the one who's wrong. And so what can he do except follow Palpatine and destroy the Order so that he can be left as the one who's in the right?
Right.
And that's where we're going here, right? So what happens next? Well, once you position yourself as a self-righteous victim in a black and white world, then you can allow contempt to control your heart. There's a David Hume quote on this. We take a piece of something and make it the whole, and then view the whole person through that lens. So now, again, Anakin views the Jedi Order as completely wrong. He now sees that piece of them as the whole thing. That lack of the ability to display emotions or to have relationships. Well, because I don't agree with that, the whole thing's off. They're all bad.
Right. Well, and he views everybody through that lens, right? And that's we all do that all the time, right? We all simplify, but he views everybody through that lens. The people that he loves, he views as only potential victims that he has to shelter. The people that he used to love, he views as not trustworthy and so opponents. The people that the one mentor that he trusts is like, well, he must be on my side, so everything he says must be true, right? And you lock yourself into this. Yep. Okay. I'm in. I've done all these things. Check, and check.
Yeah, these will be on screen, by the way. So yeah, the number 5 is materializing the contempt. So this is when it starts to be contextualized for this specific situation in your brain through events. Now, okay, well, what am I going to do about this? This is where you start to think, how does what's inside of me come outside of me? This person doesn't deserve this, so I'm going to undermine them. I'm going to take it from them. We see that with Anakin, obviously, in multiple different ways. With, he executes Order 66 with Palpatine. There's so many different examples where he then turns and undermines the people he views as wrong so that he can be vindicated. And finally, where you end up with is reality is bent. you create a hell on earth around you where there is no, like we talked about, it's a narrowing of the abilities that you have to make decisions. It is a cutting off of your relationships where the only way you can see the world now is they are wrong, I am right. Why aren't they adhering to the way that I think things should be? And that ends with our what I call the final half step, which is the action that's taken into the world where you actually, assault somebody. I mean, as far as murder or other horrible things that can happen. And like, how do we think those things happen? Well, some of it is because people are mentally ill, and some of it is because and that's all a quantum entanglement that goes
Right.
on of mental illness and contempt and all of these things that kind of build and build and build until you read these terrible stories on the news. How could somebody possibly do that? Well, how could I possibly have lashed out at somebody in that meeting?
Right. Yeah. The like you say, the cycle of anger is it builds up to these things are easier and easier to justify because of your context, because of your framing, because of the way that you've narrowed the view of the world around you. Yeah, that's yeah, that's we can all see ourselves doing that in little ways, right? And we can all see sort of where that goes. And one of the reasons we do this, right, is one of the reasons we do this podcast is because these like big splashy on-screen examples of doing it to the nth degree kind of they penetrate, like they stick to our brains, like they like, oh, okay, yeah. Anyway, I'm not going to go murder a classroom full of kids, but I am absolutely able to be angry and to depersonalize other people in my self-righteous anger and to then behave very unskillfully or in a way that's very much not going to help everybody that's around me. That's 100% a thing that I can do and have done, and have to be able to recognize when it starts to arise, when I start to ride that merry-go-round.
Yeah, so what do we do about that? I mean, if we can see a cycle, and it's a cycle that when it completes ends in tragedy and ends in even more pain, then the only thing that we can do is try to stop the cycle. And that goes back to what you were talking about with Obi-Wan. We want to stop, we're not going to be able to stop number one necessarily, getting angry because your will is thwarted. There's going to be a moment where somebody cuts you off in traffic and you're like, like, you got to be kidding me. Like, I, of course, I know how to drive better than everybody else. Everybody should adhere to the way that I'm driving currently and not cut me off, right? But stopping it there, and as the ego can tend to get wounded there, allowing for a moment to reflect. Don't let it escalate to becoming the victim in the situation, and instead, okay, do I need to just, in that situation, I can just verbally or mentally forgive that person right now in my own head and be done with
Right.
it. I don't have to worry about this. I can just keep moving, right?
Yeah, yeah. There's from the very simple things like take a deep breath, like just one in, one out. Have you actually been hurt? Really? Have
Yeah.
you actually been hurt? Right? Right? That's a simple thing to do, right? But also all the way up to kind of what we see Obi-Wan doing, right? Is the I must have been wrong, right? I must not have handled this well or it wouldn't have gotten this bad. So, what can I do better next time? How can I reach out to that person and try to do it better together next time? Like the willingness to be potentially wrong, right? That when this conflict has happened, when you got angry, when something went terribly, when you had some negative interaction, at least be open to the idea that it might be you that had screwed up.
Yeah. Yeah. Or it's at least some shade of gray in what happened in the situation, and making it black and white is the biggest possible risk. And going and having that crucial conversation with somebody one on one. This is what I notice is lost most in the world of today, is people are less and less willing for one reason or another to have these difficult conversations with each other. And I mean, in a workplace setting, I've had to get better about that. I've had good mentors that have taught me to get better at that, that when somebody wrongs you and you feel like you might start this cycle of anger, sometimes the only thing to do is to pull them aside in a one-on-one and just, reflect beforehand, compose your thoughts in a way that's kind, and just share that with them. And maybe like you said, maybe, am I really wronged? Am I really hurt? That's the first step. But then if you feel like you are, it's okay to go address that with somebody. And even more importantly, if you feel like you may have done that to somebody else, then even more impetus on me that I need to go have a conversation with that person and make it right. I don't want this cycle of anger for anybody.
Right. Well, and then in this context, and we'll talk about more of this in the next episode, I think. But in this context of of a leadership podcast or leadership lessons, if you're in the position of leadership and you feel you may have been the person that that hurt somebody, if you feel like or if at least you just acknowledge that there is some conflict, some negative interaction you're having with somebody, if they are subordinate to you or have less influence than you or in less position of a privilege than you, then they are likely not going to feel comfortable bringing it up. They're not going to feel comfortable addressing it or challenging you, right? It's gonna be on you to decide, and it might be that they did something incredibly terrible and needed to be flamed, and but letting the resentment linger about that, letting unclarity linger about that is not necessarily going to be better, right? As your leader, whether or not you were in the wrong, you're probably going to have to be the one to initiate those crucial conversations, whether to course correct yourself or to course correct somebody else. That's part of leadership responsibility. Is you can't expect somebody else to come and tell you that there's a problem that needs to be fixed, right? You can't expect somebody else to come and tell you that you were wrong, because sort of by definition they don't have that authority, or they will very, especially if you've demonstrated your anger in the past, they will very reasonably expect that this is not a thing that's going to go well. And so it just makes it harder, right? It makes it harder and harder when you're supposed to be the one that knows what's going on, when you're supposed to be the one in control, when you're supposed to be the more mature, more professional, more accomplished one. If you screwed up, then it's extra on you to figure it out. And if you haven't screwed up, sorry, but you're the leader. It's still on you.
Wow. And it brings us all the way to the end of the podcast almost here with, again, bringing back character is destiny. Because if we're able to make these decisions, if we're able to forgive, if we're able to reflect, if we're able to have those crucial conversations, what it does is, instead of going down the Anakin arc where we just keep doubling down on the internal struggles that we're having that just make us more and more navel gazers, we can have the opposite effect where you can have a narrowing and narrowing and narrowing of your ability to make good decisions. And it becomes the default response when you're damaged by somebody or you're hurt, to stop and reflect before you allow yourself to become angry, to go and address it with them directly. And then, more importantly, as a leader, even than that, is to teach others to do likewise.
Right. If you're a trustworthy partner to have those conversations with, whether you're a direct leader or not, then you can be that, that model of the magnanimous leader that's in the space. And you can at least minimize the damage that you're causing personally on a daily basis, which is a good place to start. So, yeah, doubling down on the mistakes is, I think, the lesson we take from Anakin as an emerging villain. Right? Is the cycle of fear and ego and simplifying your worldview so that you're the victim, and then feeling justified in lashing out. Right? That cycle is a thing that we can strive to break.
Yeah, and for us, it's not necessarily always as simple as it's going to be for Anakin. So setting up rituals where we, journaling, reflecting, giving ourselves the opportunity. I mean, there's a lot of practices these days around kind of like rehashing situations that we have emotional, memories of, to go back into that situation and try to understand, what is my perception of the situation? What do I think actually happened in that situation? What does the other person think happened in that situation? Okay, what should have happened in that situation? How can we then take that information and use it to go forward? So, I mean, yeah, this was a really concise key takeaways, honestly, because it's all about this cycle of doubling down on our anger, leaning more or looking more internally and less externally. And in the end, that is the lesson that we're probably going to touch on over and over in this series on villains, is whether it's about anger or about a different path to that, but the navel gazing and the
Right.
allowing your emotions to become the primary means of controlling you, that can result in you going down the wrong path, and then it becomes very hard to get back on the right path.
Right. Well, and we talked a lot about the individual's responsibility and the individual's behaviors here, which I think is the lesson from these movies and from this episode. But just to touch on it briefly at the end, the other big thing that happens here is Anakin is just listening to the wrong people. right? Is that he has people in his life who are clearly examples of kindness and caring and mentorship and success and skillfulness and all the things you would want in a leader. And he's not listening to those people because they're not telling him what he wants. Right. And so, at the very least, if you're in this situation, if you feel you're on this cycle of anger, like look around and think about who's really behaving in a trustworthy way, who may be challenging you out of love, and be open to listening to the things that you don't want to hear from people that have evidence that they have your best interests at heart.
Beautiful. That's a great way to close that.
All right. Well, that was really cool. I like where we're going with this. I think the villain sequence is gonna let us examine from a different angle some of the things about leadership that we've been talking about for so long. So next episode, I'm really looking forward to this. We're done talking about Anakin Skywalker's journey. We're going to talk about Darth Vader. We're going to talk about what it would be like to have Darth Vader in middle management at your organization. So we're looking forward to that. Thank you for joining us for this episode. And just remember, until next time, as always, character is destiny.